So hello again. My name's Mary Kay Lombino. I'm Deputy Director and Emily Hargroves Fisher 57 and Richard B. Fisher Curator at the Francis Lehman Loeb Art Center. And I'd like to welcome you all to Streaming Media, Rauschenberg and the News in 1970. This is a webinar that is part of an exhibition that's on view now until September 19th at the Loeb called Time Capsule 1970, Rauschenberg Surface Series from Currents. And we're very pleased to welcome you today. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. I just want to do a couple of housekeeping notes for everyone because this is a webinar. So you'll probably notice that we're not using the chat feature. That feature has been disabled, but we will be delivering you some news through the chat. So feel free to open that box, which you can find the icon at the bottom of your screen. And instead of chat, in order for you to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A feature, which is also an icon at the bottom of your screen. And we encourage you to use that to ask questions. You can type those in. You can either do those anonymously, or you can leave your name. And at the end of our discussion, we'll have some time to answer those questions. We'll do our best to answer as many of the questions as possible. Volume might prevent us from answering them all, and we'll also work to consolidate any repeat questions. So with that, I'd like to begin and tell you a little bit about the exhibition. So what we're seeing here on the slide is two images. The one on the right is an installation shot of our current exhibition, which I hope you'll be able to come and see if you haven't seen it already. It's, as I said, it continues until September 19th in the temporary exhibition galleries of the Loeb. And the image on the left is an image of some of these same works that we're displaying here at an exhibition in 1970. So as you might have assumed from the title, all of the work by Rauschenberg in this exhibition was made during the same year, 1970, all actually during the beginning of 1970, the first few months. And we actually planned this to be the 50th anniversary of this body of work. It was supposed to be on view during 2020, but we postponed it for this year so that more people could come and see the show. A little background, Rauschenberg, who was born in 1925, lived until 2008, is one of the most influential American artists of the second half of the 20th century. He had gained an international reputation that had solidified by the end of the 1960s through his paintings, prints, and sculptures that were often made with popular media and found objects. He composed this series of 36 collages that were constructed really solely from newspapers printed during that period of the first few months of 1970. For a project that he called the most serious journalism he's ever attempted. He then created this series of 17 screen prints from that group of work. And it was first premiered in Dayton's Gallery 12, which is the slide that you're seeing on the left, in Minneapolis in 1970. That gallery actually had become an important part of the contemporary art scene in the 60s and 70s and had a relationship with Leo Castelli Gallery in New York, which is how this came to be. The work was actually initially conceived as a large-scale drawing that was extremely ambitious installation and encompassed a combination of 81 prints and newspaper collages, and that was installed in April 1970. So that was just a little background on the body of work that we'll be discussing. In addition, though, if you come to see the show, the third gallery is filled with works from the Loeb's permanent collection, close to 20 works, selected by our guest curator, Calvin Brown, who I'm about to introduce, that relate to both this period as well as some of the techniques and concepts that are included in the current series. So with that, I'd like to ask our panelists to join me, and I will begin by introducing Calvin Brown. Hi, everybody. So Calvin Brown is an independent scholar, and we're very pleased that he agreed to be the guest curator of this exhibition. Brown recently retired as Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings at the Princeton University Art Museum, where he served since 1997. Prior to Princeton, he served as Senior Restorer in the Department of Drawings and Prints at the Metropolitan Museum of Art since 1979. And at Princeton, Brown developed or co-curated with colleagues, faculty, and students dozens of exhibitions and installations, primarily focused on 19th and 20th century prints and drawings from the museum's collections. Brown's recent projects have included 2 exhibitions co-curated with Mitra Avaspor, the Haskell Curator of Contemporary and Modern Art at Princeton, Helen Frankenthaler Prints, 7 Types of Ambiguity in 2019, celebrating a recent gift of 15 prints from the Helen Frankenthaler Foundation, and Frank Stella Unbound Literature and Printmaking in 2018, honoring one of Princeton University's most illustrious alumni. Brown originally organized this exhibition, Time Capsule 1970, Rauschenberg's Currents, together with Juliana Ox-Dweck, the chief curator at the Princeton University Art Museum, where the entire series of 18 large-scale surface series from Currents prints were briefly on view in January and February of 2019. Brown holds a degree from Cooper Union and Yale University, where he specialized in painting and printmaking as a studio practice. Helen Su is Associate Curator for Research at the Robert Rauschenberg Foundation. Su previously served as Assistant Curator at the Guggenheim Museum and as alumni of Stanford University. Her recent texts explore how Rauschenberg's work invites modes of reception and interaction that model emancipatory forms of subjectivity. Over the course of several months, meandering through a variety of digital databases, Su compiled nearly all of the sources and source images and materials that Rauschenberg used to create the studies for the Currents collages. Contextualizing the newsprint fragments in their original layouts opened up new interpretive possibilities for the series. And that's really what we're here to talk about today. We're going to mine that material for all kinds of wonderful connections. So from here, I feel like I've been doing all the talking, so I'm going to pass it on to Calvin to start us off.
Hello, everyone. I'm very glad everybody could come to see this. Time Capsule 1970 is an exhibition that, as Mary Kay had pointed out, I had originally worked on with Juliana Dweck at Princeton when I was Associate Curator of Prints and Drawings. And I first stumbled on these prints around 2004 when I was working on a pop exhibition with Hal Foster, and I was cataloging all of the pop-related materials in the museum, and found them together, 18 large-scale prints that make up the surface series from Currents, which is the official title of the print series. No individual print has an individual title. It's just they're all numbered. And I just found all of this extraordinarily, I had never seen the prints before. They're all black and white. There's a series of screen prints, and I just was intrigued to see what they were like. Always on the lookout for something to get students involved with and to kind of put on exhibition. I had thought I would love to be able to see them all together, but they're 40 inches square, so that there's no way you could just like lay them out in the study room to be able to look at them. So really, I was just always proselytizing to be able to have an exhibition of them, to just feel what they were like. There was very little literature on them at the time. So it was very difficult to kind of dive right into figuring out what these prints are. I didn't finally get the opportunity to do this until just before I retired in January and February of 2019, in a very short exhibition where we put them all up at once. And that's when we really sort of dove into them and found the treasures that Helen had kind of unearthed at the Rauschenberg Foundation, and really figured out what they were all about. And it has been great to be able to work on these. they, as we were saying earlier, they are they're based, the prints are all completely based on a series of collages made in January and February of 1970, a time of very, very strong political turmoil, social unrest, great change in American society, not unlike today, and putting them up now 50 years later, it's really kind of alarming to see how many issues are brought up in these newspaper collages that are still with us today. So that all makes a very perfect kind of installation to be able to put up in a university, in a situation where, university situation, where they can be discussed. Rauschenberg in 1970 naturally is at the height of his career. He's just spent the last, 2 years or so working in working together collaboratively with musicians and engineers and dancers, working on performance art, and he's become increasingly committed to a political agenda. I mean, to really thinking about how art and society interact. He had been in Los Angeles to produce a large series of prints based on the space program with Gemini, Gemini graphics. And when that was over, he needed a rest and conceived of this project. So that I'm going to just give you a bit of an introduction. In the fall of, some of which has already been covered. In the fall of 1969, Felice Wender, director of Dayton's Gallery 12 in Minneapolis, offered Rauschenberg the opportunity to execute a concept he had proposed for a large-scale drawing installation. Founded in 1964 in the 12th floor of Dayton's department store, Dayton's Gallery 12 had become pivotal in the Minneapolis contemporary art scene by building collaborations between Minneapolis Museum of Art and the Walker Art Center and first-rate galleries like Leo Castelli, where they would show things. Rauschenberg, they had just done an exhibition of Frank Stella, with whom Rauschenberg exhibited. Working with Stereo Studio in Glendale, California, Rauschenberg produced this exhibition, an exhibition called Currents, a massive body of work that consisted of 36 collages created entirely from newspapers and 3 related series of monumental screen prints that he had derived from them. By the time the exhibition Currents opened at Dayton's Gallery 12 in April of 1970, Rauschenberg's proposed drawing project had transformed into an ambitious installation that encompassed a total combination of 81 numbered screen prints and collages. This all right? Yeah, it's good. Rauschenberg and his assistant, Bob Peterson, began the project by collecting articles, advertisements, and images cut from more than 15 newspapers, tabloids, and broadsides. These clippings were then cut and pasted together with solvent monotype images and drawing to form 36 collages on which the project was based. The studies from Currents were referred to as studies from Currents, were then photographed, enlarged, and transferred to high contrast photolithic films used to produce the photo silk screens for 2 series of black and white screen prints. The 18 surface series from Currents, which is the subject of this exhibition, 26 features from Currents, and a single monumental screen print called Currents, which is this on your screen now. It's 6 feet tall and 54 feet wide. It's an enormous thing, and each of the squares where they reproduce or they print each one of the 36 collages that Rauschenberg made. Could I have the next slide? Oh, I should say that this is an exhibit. There are only 6 impressions of this. One is owned by the Museum of Modern Art, where it was on display at the recent Rauschenberg retrospective, and this is how they installed it. Could we see the next slide, please? So there was a little catalog that Dayton's published in 1970 to go with the exhibition that basically reproduced every single one of the collages, surface series prints, features prints, and then the one long Currents print that was reproduced as a long handout. The only text other than the, in the entire thing was this wonderful frontispiece handout, fold out, that shows, that have little photographs of, taken while they were producing the exhibition, working on it, with Rauschenberg's handwriting inscribed over it. It's really kind of amazing. And that's really pretty much the only comment that was made, in print at the time. It shows Rauschenberg's dog having puppies on top of prints, and a picture of a comet says, "We saw this in," somewhere I can't read it. But basically, down in the lower left-hand side, there's a statement by Rauschenberg that really sums up what this project is about. Considering that he was upset about the news. The world condition permitted me no choice of subject and color and method composition. That basically he felt this was the perfect medium for him to be able to do what he referred to as the greatest journalistic piece that he had ever done. And then there's also another little charming statement there where they're all kind of working around the prints, and it says, "Give the world a chance by changing it." Give the world a chance. I wrote it down differently. And then could we see the next slide, please? Then after the exhibition closed in Minneapolis, it then went to Castelli Graphics in New York, where basically it was opened at, where it opened not at the gallery, because this was all very impromptu. This is all since November of 1969. But he showed it at Animation House, which was in New York, and where a lot of Rauschenberg's EAT projects and performances were held, from July 7th to September 6th, 1970. The quote actually, so this is a handout. There's a unique kind of collage that he made just for this handout that involves many of the different collage elements that you'll see in some of the other prints. And it has like news and about politics and about environmental issues. You remember 1970 is the first year, is when the first Earth Day was organized, and Rauschenberg made a poster for that event. And then on the reverse side of it is this statement that reads, "A previously unscheduled exhibition, an active protest to share and communicate my response to and concern with our grave times and place. Art can encourage art's individual conscience. Everyone's individual devotion is the only vehicle that can nourish the seed of sanity that is essential in the construction and change that makes only all the difference in the world." And it's, he's really into this. This is a political act in some ways. And the idea that, as he mentions here, and the idea that it's work that didn't exist 4 months before, that he felt compelled to pull this all together and show it to people while it was all current. So I think, should we see the next slide? Okay. Now these are slides of 2 of the features from Current's prints. Now the features of Current's were selected, are just photographic screen print reproductions of 26 of the 36 collages. Here are 2 that were issued together. I think basically 10 of them, I guess he decided, and you'll see later, might not merit full development. But these are really kind of amazing. He screen prints a little background for them, and then they're all just printed in black ink in the way in which they appear in the collages. And you can see basically in the one on the left with the fist and a basketball player and soldiers, that basically most of these are images, right? And they're all sort of established so that they have a top and a bottom. On the right, what we're looking at is mostly text. And it's sort of, it's interesting that, and it's a wide variety of stories. You know, Cheek 7 lawyer gets 4 years. And these are things that Helen will dive into in depth so that you get a sense. Kill Army wife 2 in LSD, right? And this desperate man that's in the middle. Now, basically, can we go to the next slide? Those 2 screens are taken from, now on the left here are the 2 collages from which those images were made. And you can see the yellowing of the newsprint and the kind of the way it really feels like a cubist collage, all pasted together. To make the Surface Series prints, what Rauschenberg did was to print one on top of the other. He took all 36 screen prints and printed half in one way and then printed the second half of the screen prints on top of it. So it's a melange of 2, not only are they collages, but it's a melange of 2 different images that interfere with each other and you see through one to the other. What I want, and so that basically all 18 Surface Series prints are this kind of scramble of information. What I wanted to point out to you too is that they're printed in 2 different kinds of black. They're printed in, first there's a white screen, there's a white square of screen print ink that goes down on the paper. And then secondly, what is on the image that's on the bottom, you know, the bottom collage is printed in the photographic reverse, you know, so that you're seeing a negative image and the screen is printed in flat black ink. So you get this muted kind of quiet sort of image that goes down. And the second image that's on the top with the fist is printed on top in the positive in a glossy screen print ink. So there's a kind of shimmer or sheen to these prints when you see them. I mean, it's shocking how beautiful these are when you actually see them. It's kind of hard. I'm sorry, you have to see them only on the screen. But it ends up with this crazy kind of like interference, this kind of way of, you think you only see some kinds of images, you read it and it kind of all mashes together like you're listening to 2 different things at one time. Should we do the next slide? All right, I guess did that make sense? Yes.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you, Calvin, for breaking down the process of this series. It's quite complicated and there are quite a number of moving parts, but I think those slides hopefully gave everyone a sense of basically how they're made. And now we're going to be treated with Helen's knowledge of what they're made of. So the source material that she discovered.
Yeah, and in part, this has to do with the digitization of resources that certainly this research could be done going back into the microfilm and reeling through all of that material, but greatly aided by the fact that so much of this material is now digitized. And once you get there, I think that, you know, with that grand statement of this being a suite of work that deals with protest and an expression of Rauschenberg's own response to the turmoil of this moment, one could legitimately respond with the couple of examples that we've already seen. Where is the protest? Like, where is the commentary even? And kind of one reaction at the time and now without closer examination is sort of, well, where does Rauschenberg's stance come through in these collages, which can sometimes seem arbitrary or without that further deep dive can often pass by a person like the front pages of newspapers in the newsstand. And in fact, it's with this closer look, and I think that that's what the series models for us, is kind of sort of to take that moment of reflection to muse about what you actually see, and then to draw new connections and new possibilities from the juxtapositions that he's laid before you, and definitely surfacing the original sources provides new possibilities, but I think that those possibilities were there to begin with. And Leo, if you can back up 2 slides. You see, and I'm showing you the features because it's in a slightly larger scale, but you see this certainly more clearly in the collage as well, where this feature on the left is based on study for currents number 1. And in the Dayton's catalog, they are reproduced in sequence based on the study numbers. So if one wants to take this as the introduction to the series, I think that it serves as a manifesto of sorts, where it lays out Rauschenberg's method and it points to what the viewer should pay attention to. And a lot of it has to do with axes of difference and similarity. And so on the left, you see 2 images of National Guardsmen who are intervening in the Watts Rebellion of 1965. And you see that one is the solvent transfer of the other. So one is the mirror reverse image of the top is the original, and the bottom and the image below it is its mirror reflection. And so that is one of his most important tricks, and one of the most important tricks in his bag. And this is a process of dissimulation, where the original image is rendered a little bit strange, if not in some instances almost unrecognizable, in that simple move of providing a mirror reflection. And then in the bottom left, you see a bunch of images of twins or pairs, and one has to do with an advertisement about, can you tell the difference between these various products? And the other is a pair of speakers, so a pair that actually belongs together, and then a series that is inviting the viewer to identify the micro differentiation between 2 similar things. And even in the 2 faces at the bottom, which are just of romance, of authors of the Romantic era, it's Shelley and Byron. That's sort of a trick of graphics, right? Where 2 different things are rendered similar through a graphic representation. And so there are all of these things that happen, I think, that signal to the viewer a form of critical looking that leads to critical thinking that then really helps unpack the series as a whole, that otherwise just seems to be this mishmash of potentially merely topical news. And I'm one of the favorite figures that Calvin, one of our early discussions centered around was the seemingly enigmatic figure of the forlorn man on the bench. It's kind of like, speaking to potentially a kind of spiritual bankruptcy, if not literal bankruptcy, of this period, and kind of like, where does he come from? And in fact, and we'll get back to the source material in a second, it's from an ad about financial services. And then the other thing I wanted to point out to you is in the collage on the right, you'll notice that brick wall right below the seated man. And that's another instance of which you can tell from the collage that it's a detail extracted from a larger whole. But when you get to the source, and now you can forward 2 slides, you can see how some of his moves are, in fact, these microscopic extractions that render things abstract, that completely, without finding this page, we would never know like where it comes from or whose leg it was, or maybe even if it were recognizable as a leg. And you see how it also functions as a visual device in the collage, where the leg of Joe Frazier is extending the leg of the seated man. And so it really is like everything is on the table here. It is form, it is content, it is abstraction and representation, it is text and image, and everything is at play, and all of their recombinations are significant. And at the same time, the other really important principle for Rauschenberg's work are the values of multiplicity and polyvalence, that everything has multiple meanings, everything is read doubly, triply, if not more, and that and to always pursue that extra level, that added supplement of interpretation, and that's how the works grow. And it's kind of like, and it is a communal experience in the context of an exhibition. It is a form of personal meditation when you're just dealing with the works on your own. And I think that, like, you see that very much in the image of the fist as well, which is a gesture of defiance and subversion, but can also be an emblem of violence. And all of that is mixed up, certainly, in this period of 1970. And so I think that it requires the viewer to be more thoughtful and contemplative in their approach to a series that can sometimes appear arbitrary if you don't give it the time that it deserves. And you can move on to the next slide. One of the recurring themes, and what you get when you do give it that extended look, is the recurrence of certain threads. And one that is very compelling is this coverage of this Black Panther Party trial at the time, called the New York 21. And you see that in the headline at the bottom, Panther Brawl Rocks Court. And you also see it in this figure of Huey P. Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party. He was at the time being held in relation to the death of a cop during a traffic stop, essentially. And that is one of the deep cuts of this series. Most of his sources were very standard newspapers: the New York Times, the Daily News, LA Times, Chicago Tribune, sort of any everyday nationally available newspaper. But the deep cut of the Huey P. Newton is that it comes from a leaflet that's advocating for his release. And you will see later on in other examples where Rauschenberg also mines alternative press sources, and he's really digging deep in terms of the wide spectrum of the media. And more than anything else, I would say, rather than there being sort of glib, efficient statements of positions, the series overall is a meditation on the media, and kind of reveals some of the mechanisms of the media, and by doing so, sort of gives the viewer some new skills in terms of how to approach the reported news. And so the deep cut of Huey P. Newton on top, the Panther Brawl at the bottom. But the other thing to notice in the collage at the bottom is we see this image of Mick Jagger, sort of central right. And then in the Surface series, he marries these two in a way that, like, Huey P. Newton and Mick Jagger become sort of foils for each other. They both end up joined in the Surface series print. And you also see that once you start looking, the collage is not arbitrary at all. Potentially, like, the M at the bottom left of Mick Jagger is for Mick, and you're kind of like, oh well, why is he surrounded by these car crash images? Is that just an arbitrary choice? And this is early 1970. What happened in December 1969? It was the tragedy of the Altamont, the free concert at the Speedway, where a racetrack in Northern California, and it was a free concert given by the Rolling Stones, which ended in the death of one of the concert goers, and really reported on at the time as sort of like, this is an example of the counterculture gone wrong. Like, gone are the days of utopian hippie thinking. Like, it's sort of like the counterculture is about death and violence, and the days of utopian thinking are over. And this it's emblematic also in the Panther trial at the time, and its twin, often reported together in the news, is the trial of the Chicago 7. And you see that here too in the headline about the Angry Riot 7. And that too reveals sort of the differential regional reporting, because they are only referred to as the Riot 7 in the Chicago Tribune. Everywhere else in the United States, they're referred to as the Chicago 7 or Chi 7, as you saw in the Daily News headline earlier. And that's just that's an example that you see here. And so again, just to invite everyone, and of course, this is not a definitive read. There are other things going on. So just always providing one of very many options and possibilities. And also just a reminder that Huey P. Newton was not an unproblematic hero. at this time. You know, he too was a figure that spanned the spectrum from hero to villain, depending on who you were. He was a figure, the Black Panther Party themselves were potentially divisive. They were divisive amongst the left, and sort of a litmus test of sorts of radicality. And I think that that notion is backed up by the thumbs up, thumbs down image that you see at the right in that image, how the same image in a different rotation means completely opposite things, right? So similar to the idea of the solvent transfer, how you have the original orientation and the mirror reverse, and how that could be, are they just the same thing reflected, or does it take you to the opposite end of the spectrum? So I feel like he puts that all on the table here, and you just need to look for it. So you can move on to the next slide. So this is the announcement for the Leo Castelli exhibition. We just wanted to bring it back because it recycles a lot of the images. So again, it's the generative move of recombining, juxtaposing, and collage itself. So I would say like the medium of newsprint is, as Calvin mentioned, it references the historical avant-garde. It references how collage was used by Cubists, and that it has that art historical cachet, but it also, of course, is always tied to the time in which the news is being created, right? That it's old the second it hits the stands, and that it becomes anachronistic, but it's through this archival urge that that meaning is deposited and mined later on, so that all of this stuff also has this quantity of imminent meaning that requires future looking to pick apart. And I just wanted to note here how the Huey image moves. So it's moved from left to right, and in this case, it's also it's slapped on top of a hand that is Richard Nixon's hand, signing his signature. And I think that the other thing about this moment is that we often remember it for the counterculture, like May '68, and it has this feeling of, and certainly, you know, there is a turning point in culture, in society, and things changed. But who's the president in 1970? It's Richard Nixon. And so if there is any kind of letdown, not only in the radicality of various movements and subgroups kind of alienating the larger public, it's kind of like there was something right in Richard Nixon's claim that there was a silent majority, right? Because not only was he elected in '68, he would be re-elected in '72. And so there is this difference between the lived experience and what was going on behind the scenes, what's happening in legislation, like who are the people who show up to vote, who are the people who put lawmakers in their seats, and so this move I would say is significant in that. Yeah, like Huey is slapped on top of Richard Nixon's signature. You had the added. This is post the original suite, Abortion and the Law. That was from a Newsweek cover from spring 1970. And then What Do the Panthers Stand For is from a pamphlet about the defense of the New York 21. And this is also an opportunity, as Calvin mentioned too, that so many of the issues we see here, whether it's civil rights, environmentalism, there are articles about marijuana. You see here, there's a reporting on opioid abuse. It's kind of like, you know, there is a resonance with our current moment. And I would make the claim too that if we do a variation on a popular dinner party game, it's kind of like, this is 60 degrees of history kind of, and we can get to Kendrick Lamar from Currents in 3 degrees, where the Panthers of the New York 21, one of the defendants was Afeni Shakur, who is the mother of Tupac Shakur, who was a huge influence on Kendrick Lamar, and who is like the poet laureate of hip hop. And and there are so many other opportunities where you can play that game, and you'll see a couple of other examples later on, but you can move on. And these are the last two examples of from the series that reference the Panther Trial, and just wanted to show you that, you know, it's through the repetition, through, of course, this is what was happening in the news at the time, but I think that you've seen from the Huey image that's deep cut from this pamphlet about, from a leaflet about his defense case, then you see front page coverage to further into the paper coverage of the trial. The repetition seems to make a case that this wasn't just an arbitrary selection. Although in other cases, it's totally fair to suggest potentially an arbitrary move. And the other thing to note at the time, again, whether or not this escapes the viewer or not, that's always a possibility, right? But the Welcome to Chicago is referencing, well, not only does it signals to the viewer to think of the Chicago trial that's happening at the time, but it specifically was referencing Nixon's visit to Chicago at the time. So he's either referred to explicitly in many instances, or in this case, it's sort of this implicit nod. And then you can move on to the next slide now. So that Welcome to Chicago image from the Chicago Tribune is actually something I could not find, even though the Chicago Tribune is digitized, because we also have to remember at this time, newspapers were released in multiple editions throughout the day. And I just wanted to show you this example of the Daily News, where you've seen this image, you've seen the Panther Brawl rocks court headline, you've seen the image of this top-hatted man, and you're seeing two versions of two final versions, interestingly, of this paper. And there are at least 4 other editions from this day. And earlier too, I think that you also notice in the wide variety of source materials that Rauschenberg is using, he's also informing the viewer about different types of media, right? Where you get the aesthetic of what a tabloid paper looks like. This like bold, big headlines, kind of sometimes that drift into sort of, they're sometimes bad puns, or they're kind of like true crime haikus, and it's a mix of everything about how one could use language to stoke attention. And then you'll see the front page of the New York Times, which is the diametric opposite, right? And so I think that that's another way in which the series sort of informs the viewer about how to look at the media critically. And now we can move on. Do you want to jump in on this?
So this is I want to kind of revert back a bit to like what they look like as artworks, as physical things. You know, I mean, as I was saying earlier, when he showed them all in Dayton, at Dayton Gallery 12, there was no commentary to it. It was all one big experience. I mean, the viewer would have been engulfed in all of these images that all go together. And I'm always kind of constantly mystified by what he meant by a drawing. I mean, like, he kept referring to them as drawings. He told her that he was going to do a drawing exhibition and all that sort of stuff. And it's kind of intriguing to think that, you know, Rauschenberg is thinking of screen printing kind of as a sort of form of drawing. You know, I mean, that it's a matter of transferring an image from one place to another. And it's very little, it goes to show you how important screen printing is to not only in the history of his work, but to his creative process. And this particular series grouping of the two collages on the left and the surface series print on the right, where they're all combined, where they're both combined, brings up 2 things that I'm interested in. One is, when you see it's hard to see on your screen, but on the collages on the left, the upper one is a roll of dollar bills around, or a kind of as a candle. It's a candle wrapped in a dollar bill, and so that it looks like money is burning. And there's a little teeny image of a tree that you can't even read unless you've seen the collage. And that's it. That's all there is to it, right? The one down below is almost completely taken up with one set of type, with one sort of page about, and Helen, is that from the Berkeley Barb? Is that the one that's from the Berkeley Barb?
Exactly. You have both the Berkeley Barb and the LA Free Press here.
Wow. And so the Berkeley Barb was noted at the time as being a newspaper, a journal that was very much in favor of same-sex social relations and it was a major for the nascent community. It was a pivotal publication where people would publish stories and people would publish personals, and it was a place to communicate that was notorious at the time. What I wanted to talk about too is the idea that I think that when he's doing a collage that has very little space, he's intending to put it together. I mean, it's intention that somehow the space of the object is filled by putting a very quiet piece on top of a very busy piece. And so that I think that this idea of compiling or layering together various collage images was incipient from the very beginning. I mean, from the very conception of making the work. The other thing I want to point out is that in this collage in the Surface Series print on the right, you see a characteristic that's quite common to all of these prints, in that you have this dotted moire pattern that appears over the whole thing. That's very peculiar and one of the most interesting parts of the entire series. It makes it harder to read them. And that essentially comes from, and maybe many of you know this, but when he photographed the collages, which themselves were already printed in the images in the newspaper already were printed with a dot matrix in the newspaper. But when he goes to photograph his own collages, it's transferred to film, to be able to capture the nuance of the grays. It's done with a dot pattern, embedded in the film, so that when you go to print it, it prints in lots of teeny weeny little dots. When he lays two completely different screens over each other, or two different codoliths on top of each other, you end up with an interference, a kind of like as the two dissimilar dot patterns come in and out of phase with each other, it ends up with this accidental sort of haze of in the image that adds a geometric aspect to it. And it's like the feedback from a guitar, I mean, it's not intended, but it's something that, or an overtone. And it's extraordinary. And it almost implies that it's because of all the buzz of the news, of all the bombardment of all these different stories, you end up with this hum, this kind of like third sound, or this third quality, visual quality, that becomes part of it. And a little Marshall McLuhan-like, if you ask me. I mean, I think. But that's what I want to say about that.
Also, I mean, his interest in sound, we know, is actually a component of the exhibition. If you come and see the show, you can also hear the show, because there's a soundtrack that he created from two different tracks overlaid on top of one another in a very similar way as the Surface Series prints are. And they're two newscaster announcements, and you can just make them out, but they're the interference of the other one, and also the kind of static of not really being able to hear it fully, is very similar to the effect that you were just describing with the feedback or the moire pattern. I think those metaphors are perfect for this particular work, and for Rauschenberg's interest in that multimedia aspect of his own work and the world, really.
And I actually think that it's intriguing that not only has he invented this kind of technologically innovative way of making screen prints, and screen printing is, on this level, is pretty new in 1970. I mean, like, to be able to do it on this scale and with this sort of precision as a fine art form is pretty interesting. But he comes up with a novel visual equivalent of the point that he's trying to make, which I think is really interesting. Could we go to the next one, please, 14? And one of the statements that he makes at the time kind of sums up some of this, I think, in an interesting sort of way. And because it's so small there, I thought I'd read that too, if you're not tired of hearing me read. I want to shake people awake. I want people to look at the material and react to it. I want to make them aware of individual responsibility, both for themselves and the rest of the human race. It has become easy to be complacent about the world. The fact that you paid a quarter for your newspaper almost satisfies your conscience. Because you have read your newspaper, you have done your bit. And so you wrap your conscience in your newspaper, just like you wrap your garbage. I made that series as realistically as I could, as austerely as possible, in the most direct way I knew how. Knowing that it was art, people had to take a second look, at least the facts that they were wrapping their garbage in. And I think that really says a lot about how Rauschenberg works, what he felt about the time. I find it interesting, he doesn't actually say where his politics are, although I'm sure we could guess, but he just puts it all out there. And, for you, I mean, it's your responsibility to kind of come to a conclusion, out of all this morass of images. Go ahead, we should go to the next one. There's the dollar bill we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. And so where you were headed with that, how you were like, oh, it's this rolled up money that's on fire. And the executive director of the Rauschenberg Foundation, actually, that was the value to her, Kathy Halbrecht, where she saw that image, especially in its starkness, that it is essentially the only image in that collage, how she was like, this is a critique of capitalism. This is a very succinct visual manifesto of that position. But in fact, once we get back to the source, it's part of an ad that promotes consumption, but it's both in the way that he's used it, right? And that, just for the attendees to keep in mind this Washington's birthday sale, because you will see that again. He does use the headline, but by separating the two, and again, that's another strategy of the collage method, that you decontextualize and recontextualize, and in the process transform something. And so that it is both. It is in its original, not intended as such, but with a simple sleight of hand, it does become potentially this image critiquing capitalism. You can move on. And just to show you some additional examples of alternative press that he's brought into the series. So you see the Spokane Natural, from which he gets the runoff flushes raw sewage to river, and Challenge, the newspaper. It's the subheadline is the revolutionary newspaper. It's the paper still in print of the Progressive Labor Party. And just because it's there, it must be noted that, there's a bit of humor here involved too, how he puts the joint in proximity to the bucket of fried chicken that also is offering free pie. That there is a news savvy to the way he approaches these things, that in some instances one could say, oh, the juxtaposition is arbitrary. In others, it becomes pretty loaded, and you'll see an example of that coming up as well. But Calvin, do you want to speak to these?
I think we should keep moving, but I think that what is interesting to me here is how, he went out of his way to draw from, honored news sources and really sensationalistic news stories, newspapers, the Daily News and the Times, the Challenger and, the Daily News. Very tabloid type things. And so that puts the texts puts you in a position where you have to kind of judge which side the story is going towards. If you keep going, go ahead, let's see about, because it brings up the issue of fake news, I think, that is all so much discussed today, and about how manipulated the media can be. So let's see the next slide. Let me see what it is. Doink. We could probably keep going. One more. Oh, these are all good.
So this is an example where you brought up the question of and Mary Kay brought this up too, of what is Rauschenberg's position? Where is it?
Right.
And I think the key for him too was also to be subtle, right? That that sort of like in the lane of art, like this is not the place to sloganeer, to again, like, you know, to provide that pithy, position statement, that's not what this is. This is about, this is a long game of reflection, contemplation, and sort of figuring it out, right? That the headline is not the history, and that it's sort of making the information available, but the processing happens over time. And on the right, you see all of those GM headlines and the pictures from the factories are from the New York Daily World, self-proclaimed the only daily Marxist newspaper in the United States, which it was at the time, sure, yeah. I guess. And here on the left, you see the headline about Teddy Lee's opposition to Carswell. Yet another event that kind of echoes the turbulence of the present, where that was Harold Carswell was a conservative judge who was being nominated to the Supreme Court by Richard Nixon. And in this case, the drama was playing out now, but he would eventually be defeated in the Senate. And kind of like playing another 6 Degrees game, it's that eventually pushed Nixon to nominate Harry Blackmun to the Supreme Court, who then would go on to write the deciding to write the majority decision in Roe v. Wade. And so it's kind of, you know, like the long game of history. A lot of threads that you see here lead in unexpected directions, and then in the collage on the right, you see that reiterated in the pictures. Now you see Ted Kennedy's headshot atop sort of this the image of Carswell knocked over, and kind of sort of almost imagining that defeat, which hadn't yet been written. And I would posit that this is a case where he's revealing his hand in this way that is subtle, you know, that requires this this close looking and unpacking to get there. But you can move on.
Okay. So this ends up with, I think this is where I wanted to talk a bit about fake news. I mean, see, new ritual slayings, right? I mean, is a kind of, I mean, that would be from the Daily News. I mean, that would be and it goes to show you that there was, you know, it was only a few years before when the famous Sharon Tate murders happened with Charles Manson, and the public was thinking that, you know, that the world is, the drugs are destroying the, you know, the world. And that the headline there, which you can't quite see, says new ritual slayings, 3 die in Tate-like murder, reporting on a news story, a then breaking news story about a former Green Beret captain named Jeffrey McDonald, who claimed that 4 hippies under the influence of LSD had broken into his home in Fort Bragg, North Carolina in February of 1970, and had ritualistically murdered his pregnant wife and 2 young daughters. And it was shocking, it was sensational, just the stuff for tabloids and all that sort of stuff. It turns out that, like, Captain McDonald actually killed his own family and was convicted of it in 1979 and is still doing time today. So it wasn't really news as much as it was the story happened, but it was all being twisted by, you know, by a sensationalistic press to get the, you know, the most, you know, out of it. And it's just, it really that really has a resonance, I think, in the way media gets, you know, manipulated today.
Yeah, no, and I think it's a comment too on the what is the point of the news? Is it to sell newspapers? Today we would call that kind of news headline clickbait. Is it to get more eyes on each story, or is it about truth? And I think what Rauschenberg allows us to see is that there are both things going on here. And he's, as Helen says, he's really giving us sort of a crash course on how to best navigate this very confusing, cacophonous way in which news is delivered to us. So that, I think, has, these objects have echoes to the present in so many ways. And, especially when you talk about that idea of having the morning, afternoon, and evening, version of the newspaper. It's the same as refreshing your screen on the New York Times website, and then also quickly going and checking what is happening on Fox News, right? So definitely echoes into the present. And I think I just want to encourage everyone who's here as an attendee, if you do have questions, to drop them into the Q&A. I don't have any at the moment, so if we want to keep going, we have a little bit more to say about this last section about the alternative press.
Sorry about that.
No problem. Oh, and this is where you see
Mailman.
Washington's birthday sale come back. And again, if you saw all of the prints together, or if you saw this print next to the dollar bill print, I don't think you would naturally understand that the two actually came from the same source. But that's sort of one of the extras that that researching the original source material gave. But if you could back up one, I just wanted to say one more thing about the previous. So I'd made a point about study number 1 being potentially the beginning. And now you're looking at study 36. And again, this might be illusory. The sequencing may not be that important, but I think in the end, you see sort of these crumpled dollar bills in potentially vertical axis, and potentially the dollar bills are kind of like the status quo and like American capitalism, consumerism that you see there set up as the vertical axis, on top of which is this horizontal axis of these images of the desert, right? And sort of the central image of the horizontal axis. And so you have, at least visually, certainly these axes of opposition, is a film still from Zabriskie Point. And that, I would argue, is referencing popular culture at the time. It's a movie that's aged well, I think, and that not without criticism, but certainly was a film that tried to speak to, if not represent, the counterculture. And I think that this is another an example I would say is that there's more going on here than a random slapdown of arbitrary clippings, and that if you look for it, and perhaps more than anything else, it's that, we are creatures of interpretation and thinking, and that, like, as thinking individuals, we'll invent meaning if it's not there. But I feel like that is also exactly the impulse that Rauschenberg appeals to in the ways in which his works are elusive, if not opaque, and that opacity is a productive quality, that it forces one to think, and it forces one to see through what may be initially a resistant surface. So sorry, I just wanted to add that before I move on.
So we're just a little bit over time now. It went by very quickly because there's just so much information embedded in each one of these prints. And I will say, as Calvin says, it's very difficult to see them on the screen and to see all of these details. However, as you can see in this slide on the right, these are large scale prints. They're each 40 by 40 inches. They have so much to offer when you get up close and you spend some time. So I do encourage people to come and see the exhibition in person. And there is actually, I think, one question that just came through that says, can you possibly expand on the choice of screen printing as the choice of medium, which I think we touched on just a little bit, but if we don't mind going over a little bit, Calvin, maybe you can start and answer that question, and then Helen, feel free to chime in.
Well, I mean, like, there are a number of things about it. I mean, but I think it's a great question. And I think these prints are a perfect example of choosing exactly the right medium for, for the project. It's very easy to, screen printing lends itself really easily to photo processes. It's a very easy, simple thing to be able to take the film and you take the screen and you coat it in, in an emulsion, photosensitive emulsion, and you just shoot the negative right onto it, wash it out, and you've made the stencil that you need for screen printing. You don't need a press. I mean, you can do it all in anywhere where there's, where you have a sink or, in the materials, and so it makes it quick. I mean, they were screen printing in the gallery. I mean, that's a 54 long foot piece of paper, and you just put the screens down and just do it right there, and you keep going. So, I mean, it's a very adaptive medium that copies photographic material well, which suits him beautifully. It's very flat, it doesn't have any persona to it. There's no affect to it. Which appeals to some art, to Warhol, and it appeals to Rauschenberg. The fact that all the expression is in the image, it isn't in how it's made. It almost looks like it's super fast. And then the third part is that screen printing is one of the very few printing mediums, or can be, but it's one of the few that doesn't actually reverse the image. That the way the image looks on the screen is the way it's going to look on the print, just like offset printing does. And so that if you're working images back and forth quickly, he knows it'll come out looking exactly like the collages, and the people will be able to read it, without his going through a second process, and so all of those things just kind of meld all together. And like I was saying, like it's in the mid 60s, and they start to really develop screen printing as a fine art form. Before that, it had largely been only commercial, and it was its commercial technical aspects that appealed to certain artists like Rauschenberg. And there he is screen printing on his canvases and stuff. You could screen print on t-shirts, anything you want, Does that answer the question some?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I also think that since you did evoke Warhol, and there is one more topic that we were going to cover, there is actually a Warhol print from his Flash series in the exhibition, as well as another print in a small exhibition we have in the Hoy Gallery. I think it's worth going back to the slide right before this so we can talk about the image.
So Helen, do you want to say what?
It is also, it's sort of Warhol by proxy even, right? That like Warhol's name is invoked and he produced the film, but it's directed by someone else. And it also is referring to an earlier work, that this is a film from '68 that is now being revived, and that like it's sort of it's a success to scandal kind of thing. It was censored in London, and how there is this you can read this text very clearly in all versions of the print, but that middle section that says that is a nod to its censorship in London, and so it's inviting all holders of a British passport to come see the movie for free, and this is an ad in the New York Times too. So I think that just the difference of 2 years makes all the difference in the world. And I also see this not only as a nod to potentially to Warhol, and that it's Warhol and Rauschenberg who were the principals of making silkscreen a fine art form, right? That like it's their paintings from 62 on, that like that's really where it gets started. And so, and also I feel like we're contractually obligated to say, yes, Warhol got there first. Rauschenberg visited his studio and learned the technique from him, but took it in different directions and did his own thing. And I think that it was the physicality of hand-pulled silk screening too that appealed to him, and that speaks to what you were discussing before about how are these drawn, so that there is that element in the background, where it is manipulating the screens and pulling the prints are a very physical, manual form of production. And also the fact that this then ends up within 2 years as celebrated in the New York Times as an ad. It's kind of also how quickly the vanguard becomes absorbed by the mainstream, or certain wings of the mainstream.
That's true.
Thank you. Yeah, that actually, it really kind of ties it up with a nice neat bow, because I think the same thing is happening with the counterculture sort of idea. Is it's so on the edges at the beginning of this conversation when he begins to gather these materials, and it just becomes more and more mainstream as it moves forward. So let's see, I don't see any other questions coming in. Are any last comments by either Calvin or Helen that you want to add?
I was going to say that, I don't know, it's not really a comment, but like an observation. First of all, it was an extraordinarily fun thing, project to be able to pull this together and to work with you on it. When I was staying at the hotel while we were kind of like putting it together, I had to go down. I mean, in these COVID times, you have to be socially distanced from everybody in the lobby. But so I went down, so it all feels a little, and I went down to where you pick up the breakfast stuff, your whatever stale little bagel you get in a little cup of coffee. And on there, without any comment, nobody was even watching. It was a big screen TV with Fox News on at about 9 o'clock in the morning. And they're shouting at me, they're shouting the most outrageous, silly things, and here I'm trying to read the paper on my phone, and I'm trying to eat my breakfast, and I'm doing this show. And I just think that he's right. He touches on something that we're constantly being bombarded with all kinds of information, and whatever it is, that's a major part of the way we experience life today. And it's underscores the genius of Rauschenberg to find a unique way to do it, to be able to describe that and put it out there in a work that he's never done before, and to pull it all together in 3 months. I mean, it's just it's extraordinary juggling act. It's a pleasure to kind of put together, to work with. And I have to say, I totally admire that all the resources that the Rauschenberg Foundation has pulled together. It's of the most impressive, including that audio tape of 2 different news broadcasts, and it's an extraordinary thing. It's an extraordinary resource.
Yes, so thank you to the Rauschenberg Foundation, and thank you to Calvin and to Helen for this wonderful discussion. I hope people can come and see the exhibition. I hope you enjoyed this panel. And for more events coming up in the fall, please visit our website. And we are going to be open Tuesday through Sunday, 11 to 5, for the rest of the run of the show, right up until September 19th. So thanks again, everyone, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.